It was the summer of 1943. The war was still raging across Europe and North Africa, but for thousands of German soldiers, the fight was already over. They were men of the vaunted Afrika Korps, sunburned, gaunt, still carrying the dust of the desert on their uniforms. For months they had faced the British Eighth Army, until supply lines collapsed and Rommel's dreams of victory dissolved in the sand. Now they stood crowded on the decks of Liberty ships, bound not for a prison in Egypt or Britain, but for a destination most had never imagined, the United States of America. For many of them, the ocean voyage itself felt unreal. The ships were new, spotless, humming with activity. Some prisoners whispered that the vessels had been built in mere weeks, a rumor they dismissed as Allied propaganda. Yet as they inspected, the weld seams and smelled the fresh paint. A quiet unease settled in. Could that possibly be true? At night, when the Atlantic wind howled over the decks, the prisoners spoke softly in disbelief. "If they can build ships like this so quickly," one murmured, "how many more can they build?" No one answered. They were soldiers, not economists, but a seed of wonder, and fear had been planted. When dawn broke on the horizon after days at sea, a shadow rose out of the mist. It wasn't Europe. It wasn't Africa. It was something altogether different, a skyline distant yet gleaming, stretching wider than they had ever seen. The guards told them, "Welcome to America." The train ride from the East Coast into the American heartland was supposed to be a simple transfer to their prison camps. Instead, it became their first revelation. The Germans had lived through blackout after blackout. In Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, every night the lights went out, cities swallowed by darkness to hide from bombers. Even cigarettes were forbidden near windows. But here the night blazed. As the train rolled through the countryside, electric lights shimmered for miles, gas stations glowing like little stars, neon signs buzzing above diners and houses lit warmly even past midnight. One prisoner, writing in a small notebook, captured the moment. "The Americans must be lying to us. No nation could possess such abundance. This cannot be real." When the train stopped for refueling in Texas, the prisoners pressed their faces to the glass. Women in floral dresses strolled by. A young boy on a bicycle waved. And beyond the platform, a town glowing with energy, untouched by rationing or fear. They whispered among themselves, "Are they not at war?" "Oh, they are," said a guard, overhearing. "We just don't stop living for it." It was a line that would stay with many of them for years to come. Their destination was a sprawling camp near Mexia, Texas. Hundreds of wooden barracks laid out like small cities, ringed by fences and watchtowers. As the prisoners stepped off the train, expecting harsh voices and rifle butts, they were instead met by quiet efficiency. American soldiers directed them with calm gestures. The men were processed, medically examined, and given fresh clothes. Some were even offered coffee. For many, it was their first taste of American hospitality, and their first shock of confusion. The bunks were clean. The food portions were generous. The guards spoke politely. Even the barbed wire seemed almost symbolic rather than threatening. One of the older German NCOs looked around and muttered, "They have built this for us? In the middle of a war?" Indeed they had. The United States was housing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, not in squalor, but with an almost bureaucratic precision that reflected the nation's industrial scale. That evening, as the men unpacked their new uniforms, stenciled PW across the back, the camp lights flickered on. From the windows, they could see the faint glow of the nearby town. Shops still open, cars still driving, the faint echo of music from a distant radio. And in that strange, almost peaceful moment, many realized that they had entered not a land of propaganda, but a new world entirely. In the weeks that followed, routine settled in, roll calls, meals, work details. Yet beneath the surface, the prisoners' disbelief only deepened. They were taken by truck through endless miles of farmland, cotton fields, wheat, corn, all tended by machines that roared and clattered like living beasts. One POW later wrote that he had seen a single machine harvesting what would take 100 men back home. They watched as tractors plowed with mechanical precision, while farmers, often alone, commanded fields stretching to the horizon. In Germany, war had turned every able man into a soldier. Women and the elderly toiled in factories and fields. Here, machines did the labor of armies. The contrast was staggering. America's strength, they realized, wasn't just in numbers. It was in the union of people and industry, the way a nation's imagination had turned steel and oil into unending productivity. Back in camp, they ate meals that would have been a feast in wartime Europe: eggs, meat, fresh bread. Some refused at first, thinking it a trick for propaganda photographs. But the meals kept coming, every day, without fail. The waste alone was incomprehensible to men raised in scarcity. "We threw away more food than my family has seen in 3 years," one prisoner whispered to another. And as they lay awake at night listening to the buzz of power lines outside the fence, many began to ask the question none dared voice aloud. If America can feed even its enemies like this, how could we ever hope to defeat it? By autumn, the camps had settled into rhythm. Work crews helped local farmers bring in harvests, earning small wages for their labor. Some even wrote home to families in Germany through Red Cross channels, describing what they saw, carefully, yet with unmistakable awe. But the true transformation was internal. The same men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler's dream now found themselves questioning everything. They had been told Americans were decadent, divided, enslaved by capitalism. Instead, they saw a society in motion, imperfect, yes, but confident, overflowing with life and freedom. They watched black and white soldiers joke together while unloading supplies, an image that stunned many who had grown up under Nazi racial laws. They saw newspapers printed freely, criticizing their own government, something unthinkable in the Reich. And they saw something else, a kind of quiet decency in their captors. Guards shared cigarettes, doctors treated them without contempt, chaplains offered Bibles without sermons. The propaganda had said the Americans would humiliate them. Instead, they treated them as men. It was a disarming kindness, one that struck deeper than any bomb. In the hush of the Texas night, beneath a sky burning with unfamiliar stars, some of those men began to whisper prayers they hadn't uttered in years. They weren't praying for victory anymore. They were praying to understand what kind of world they had been fighting against, and what kind they now glimpsed through the wire. By the winter of 1943, something remarkable began to happen inside the camps. The prisoners, once proud, soldiers of Hitler's Reich, started asking for English lessons. At first it puzzled their guards. Why learn the language of your captors? But curiosity is a quiet contagion. Soon, classrooms were filled. Rough wooden benches, blackboards salvaged from supply crates, and prisoners hunched over grammar books. The Americans, pragmatic as always, saw an opportunity. They provided textbooks, newspapers, even volunteer teachers, civilians who drove to the camps to teach in the evenings. For the Germans, these lessons became more than just a pastime. They were a window into a world their propaganda had never shown. Through the pages of American newspapers, they read about free elections, debates, strikes, and protests. They saw headlines criticizing the government, printed without fear. They read editorials by ordinary citizens speaking their minds. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher from Munich, said quietly to a fellow POW, "In Germany, this would have sent the editor to a camp. Here, it sells papers." Each lesson dismantled another wall of illusion. Slowly, the men began to understand that the America they had fought wasn't an empire of decadence. It was a nation of contradictions, energy, and ideals. And for the first time in years, they were allowed to think freely. The Red Cross mail system became a lifeline between worlds. Every few weeks, the prisoners were handed pale envelopes stamped with censor marks, thin paper that smelled faintly of home. Wives wrote from bombed-out cities, mothers from villages under ration, children they hadn't seen in years scribbling uneven letters. The contrast between their families' suffering and their own safety was unbearable. They felt guilt, relief, confusion. One man confessed to his bunkmate, "My family is hungry, and I am eating better than I ever did in the army." Some tried to describe what they saw, carefully, always aware that letters were read by censors. "We are treated fairly," they would write. "There is work, food, books." But the real message lay between the lines. Their tone, their hope, their softened disbelief, it told more than words ever could. The guards noticed the change. Fewer arguments, fewer escape attempts. The men seemed quieter, more reflective. When Christmas came, the local townspeople, farmers, shopkeepers, church congregations, sent hundreds of small parcels to the camps. Homemade cookies, playing cards, tobacco, even tiny Christmas trees. Some prisoners refused at first, thinking it must be propaganda. But the gifts kept coming, from ordinary Americans, from the same people whose sons were fighting theirs across the ocean. That night, candlelight flickered through the barracks as the prisoners sang Stille Nacht. The guards listened from outside the wire, hats in hand. For a few moments, the war seemed very far away. By the spring of 1944, news from Europe reached the camps more steadily. Allied landings in Italy, air raids over Hamburg, and then, in June, the invasion of Normandy. When the guards told them, a heavy silence fell. The room felt smaller. Even the most ardent believers in the Reich seemed to deflate. They asked for newspapers, and for once the Americans provided them. The headlines, the photographs, the scale of it all. Tens of thousands of ships, planes, vehicles. The industrial might of America and her allies unleashed in full. The Germans read the numbers again and again. It wasn't the courage of the soldiers that shocked them. It was the logistics, the sheer capability. They remembered the Liberty ships, the endless trains, the fields of tractors. And now they understood. One prisoner whispered to another. They didn't win because they were lucky. They built this victory. In that moment, for many, the ideology of Nazi invincibility died. They began to talk more openly about what they had believed, what they had done, what it all meant. Some were angry, others ashamed. A few broke down completely, muttering that they had been betrayed by their leaders, their newspapers, their own blindness. The Americans called it ideological collapse. The prisoners called it something simpler, waking up. As the war in Europe neared its end, the tone inside the camps shifted again. The fences still stood, but the air felt lighter. The prisoners were allowed to work outside more frequently, repairing roads, helping in sawmills, harvesting crops. They were paid a small wage, most of which went into a savings account they could claim after the war. But the real payment was something else: trust. They worked side by side with American civilians who, at first, kept their distance. But over time, a strange friendship grew. Farmers began offering the men lemonade on hot days. Children waved as trucks passed. Shopkeepers sometimes slipped them candy or cigarettes. One POW remembered working in a field when the farmer's wife brought out a pitcher of cold water. She poured it for each man, smiling shyly, and said, "You're far from home. God bless you." He said later that moment broke him, not from guilt, but from gratitude. When you are treated like a man, he said, you begin to act like one again. Inside the camp, the prisoners organized orchestras, soccer matches, even theater plays. The guards often attended, clapping and laughing. For a few hours, everyone forgot who was who. Some of the men started writing essays for the camp newspaper, discussing freedom, democracy, art, faith, topics banned in Germany for over a decade. It was as if, behind barbed wire, they were learning what freedom truly meant. The spring of 1945 brought the news they had both longed for and dreaded. Germany had surrendered. Hitler was dead. The war was over. There was no cheering in the camps, only silence. Many sat alone, staring at the ground. They didn't know whether their families were alive or dead. When radio bulletins played, they heard names of cities: Dresden, Berlin, Cologne, spoken with words like ruins, ashes, famine. Their homes had become graveyards. For the Americans, the war was ending in victory. For the prisoners, it was ending in loss beyond measure. But in that grief, something fragile began to grow. Clarity. They had seen a world that contradicted everything they had been taught. They had seen kindness instead of cruelty, abundance instead of deprivation, dignity instead of propaganda. One prisoner wrote in his journal, "We came here believing we were the master race. We leave knowing we were servants of a lie. As the months passed, the camps began preparing for repatriation. The men packed their few belongings, photographs, books, small gifts from Americans. They left behind gardens they had planted, workshops they had built, friendships they had never expected, and as they boarded trains once again, some looked back at the waving guards and townsfolk and whispered something extraordinary. "We will not forget this America." They left America in small groups across 1945 and 1946, trains heading east, ships churning toward a continent that looked nothing like the one they'd left. The men carried what they could: a tin of coffee, a book they'd read a dozen times, a photograph of the farmer's daughter who'd given a Christmas cookie. Some took more intangible things home: a new word for freedom, a memory of being treated like a man. The return voyage was quieter than the trip out. There was no gawking at the decks now, no whispered rumors about the speed of ship production. Instead, men passed the time rewriting their histories for themselves. On board, they traded stories of American towns, of the laugh of a child in a field, of a hospital that had used penicillin when their own doctors had none. They arrived back at ports in Europe to rubble and ration lines. Cities they had known as boys were now skeletons of stone and brick. When they stepped off the train and walked toward the familiar streets, they often found neighbors they no longer recognized: gaunt faces, hollow-eyed women, children who had been toddlers when the men left and now spoke of shortages as if they were facts of the world. For many, the collision of what they had endured and what they had seen in America produced a wrenching clarity. They had once believed the German myth of self-sufficiency and superiority. They returned to a country that needed everything rebuilt. In homes where fathers had been silent about politics, there was now awkward conversation. How do we feed our children? Where will we work? Who can lead? These practical questions were the soil for deeper changes. A remarkable thing happened over the next decade. Fragments of what the men had seen in America began to show up in the rebuilding of West Germany. Some returnees entered politics. Others became engineers, teachers, factory managers, agronomists. They had memories of mechanized harvesters, of the way a properly designed factory hummed, of schools that taught public debate. They brought back not only skills but expectations, that rebuilding could mean opportunity, rather than the re-establishment of elites. Consider the small towns that asked how to rebuild their electrical grids. A former POW who had worked near an Alcoa plant remembered the sheer scale of American power distribution and argued, quietly but persistently, that a village could be electrified if it coordinated with neighboring farms and towns. The ideas spread. Machines replaced some hand labor. Yields rose. The sight of combines traversing once fallow fields became less foreign. Historians have argued that first-hand exposure to American industry and agriculture helped accelerate West Germany's recovery. These men had learned, by seeing and touching, that mass production and decentralized prosperity were possible. The lessons were practical, and crucially, non-ideological: how to run a workshop, how to organize a class, how to manage a cooperative farm. Part 13. Education, music, and the quiet reforming of minds. Not all conversion came from machines or markets. Some of the most durable changes came through music halls and classrooms. Inside the camps, the Special Projects Division and local volunteers helped organize classes: basic English, civics, mathematics, and vocational subjects. Prisoners voraciously consumed these lessons. Libraries were set up at many camps. Camp newspapers debated ideas once forbidden in Germany. Guest lecturers, including university professors and even émigré scholars, gave talks that challenged long-held certainties. Music and theater, small gestures, but with outsized effects. Bands formed from the prisoners' own ranks. German songs were performed alongside American standards. Soldiers and captives together applauded a performance. The common language in those moments was not doctrine but beauty. And beauty is a steady teacher. In camps such as Herne, Aliceville, and Concordia, prisoners' voluntary educational programs flourished, evolving into what has been called a kind of barbed wire college, a space where learning and reflection went on behind fences. For many, that was the moment of moral reckoning. Not a lecture about alternatives, but the experience of being treated as learners and collaborators. It is easy in retrospect to catalog factories and lifts, to list numbers and square footage, but the prisoner's testimony reveals an even more persuasive teacher. everyday ordinariness. They watched workers, men and women, black and white, clocking in, taking lunch, going home to houses with radios and refrigerators. That ordinariness undermined the extraordinary claims of Nazi myth. Liberty ships were a case in point. These mass-produced cargo vessels came to symbolize American industrial volume. Thousands of prefabricated parts, yards that launched hulls in record time. The SS Robert E. Peary was famously assembled in a matter of days as a publicity demonstration of industrial organization. The scale was not a theatrical trick. It was a logistical reality the prisoners could see and measure. For men who had been told that the United States was a decadent, divided nation, the reality of industrial coordination was shattering. At home, the sight of combines, of mechanized cotton gins, of steel plants that glowed through the night. These images replaced propaganda with proof. When newspapers printed photos of assembly lines or of harbors filled with cargo, the men read not just stories but evidence. They did not win because fate favored them, one returned POW later wrote. They organized the work. The war ended with treaties and maps redrawn, yet the quiet work of forging new relations took years. The men who had once been the enemy became bridges. Some immigrated, some wrote letters home that continued for decades. Others returned to teach a neighbor the techniques they had seen abroad. In the United States, reunions of former prisoners and their American acquaintances became events of healing. In 1985, hundreds of former POWs met in Texas and in other places to remember the strange kindnesses and to pay tribute to the transformations they had undergone. They spoke not of victory parades but of simple human decencies. The nurse in a camp hospital who stitched a wound with steady hands, the farmer who shared a pie, the librarian who lent a book without asking for a promise. The legacy of this experience is subtle, hard to measure in a single statistic. But historians point to a pattern. The exchange of ideas that happens when humans meet in ordinary work and shared study can unmake the strongest illusions. For these men, the lesson was elemental, that prosperity grows from cooperation, that dignity matters to productivity, that the future of a nation is made by what its people build together. We close where many of the stories inside these camps began, with a simple morning light. A former soldier wakes in a small German apartment in the 1950s. He opens his window and watches the neighbor walk to a bus that will take him to a factory he helped rebuild. He remembers the night train through Virginia and Texas, the electric lights that had once seemed impossible, the smell of bread that had been thrown away. He feels in his chest a mixture of shame and gratitude and something else, a stubborn hope. This is not the tidy moral of a fable. It is a human record, a witness to the fact that power is persuasive only when it is combined with decency, and that rebuilding a nation takes machines and laws and, most of all, a willingness to be taught by what you have seen.